This is big. God, how cool is
A major decision from the Supreme Court that could have larger implications on gun laws nationwide.
Justice's ruling this morning, it conflicts with the Second Amendment's right to bear arms.
But public safety concerns must be addressed in ways that are lawful.
Will allow scrutiny for all gun laws pertaining to everything: assault weapons, age restrictions, restrictions on magazines.
For 134 consecutive years, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has been known as the absolute graveyard where Second Amendment cases go to die, rejecting every single challenge to restrictive firearm laws with such consistency that attorneys literally stopped filing cases there because defeat seemed inevitable before arguments even began. But on August 14th, 2025, something unprecedented happened that nobody saw coming. The same court that had crushed gun rights claims for over a century issued a final mandate, not a temporary opinion or a suggestion that could be reversed, but a legally binding order striking down one of California's strictest firearm laws and making it permanent precedent across 9 Western states. But here's what makes this situation genuinely explosive and why California lawmakers are already in open defiance. Within weeks of this historic ruling, the state legislature introduced Assembly Bill 1078 proposing a 3 guns per month limit using the exact same rationing logic the court just declared unconstitutional. And legal experts are calling this a direct test of whether states can simply ignore constitutional boundaries by repackaging the same restrictions with different numbers. Once you understand why this represents the first Second Amendment mandate in Ninth Circuit history after literally thousands of rejected cases, why the court compared gun purchase limits to restricting religious worship to once monthly or limiting how often journalists can publish, and what it means that California cannot appeal this decision, because a mandate is the court's absolute final word that even the Supreme Court has no obligation to review, you'll realize this isn't just another legal victory that disappears overnight. It's a permanent crack in the legal firewall that anti-gun advocates have relied on for generations, and the battle over whether this precedent actually holds or gets buried under new legislation will determine the future of constitutional rights across the entire Western United States. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has carried a reputation for more than a century that every gun rights attorney knew by heart. Since its creation in 1891, this court has sided almost exclusively with government regulation over individual liberty when it comes to firearm cases. Across decades spanning background check challenges, magazine capacity ban lawsuits, and waiting period disputes, the result remained depressingly consistent every single time. Gun owners lost, attorneys stopped filing cases, legal experts openly called it the graveyard where Second Amendment claims went to die. That unbroken streak of 134 years ended with a case called Nguyen versus Bonta. For the first time in the court's entire history, the Ninth Circuit didn't just issue a favorable opinion that could be reversed later. It released something far more powerful, a mandate. In legal terms, a mandate represents the court's absolute final word, making the decision binding precedent across its entire jurisdiction covering 9 Western states. This wasn't a temporary panel win that would vanish on appeal. This was permanent. The case itself overturned California's 1 gun per month purchase rule. It reaffirmed the constitutional principle that rights cannot be rationed by time or arbitrary quantity limits. It marked the first ever Second Amendment mandate in Ninth Circuit history. For gun rights advocates who had spent generations watching this court crush their cases, it represented more than just a legal victory. It was proof that even the nation's most restrictive circuit court can no longer ignore the constitutional standard established by Bruin. At the center of this fight stood one fundamental question: can a state government ration a constitutional right? California's Penal Code Section 27,535 had limited residents to purchasing 1 handgun every 30 days, even after they passed all required background checks and waiting periods. Plaintiffs in the case argued that this rationing rule transformed the Second Amendment from a constitutional right into a government-issued privilege. They cited New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, the landmark Supreme Court decision from 2022, which requires modern gun laws to align with America's historical tradition of firearm regulation. The problem for California was simple. No such historical tradition exists. There's no founding-era precedent for limiting how often law-abiding citizens may acquire firearms. The state completely failed to demonstrate any historical analog from the nation's founding period that would justify rationing access to constitutionally protected arms. In June 2025, a three-judge Ninth Circuit panel agreed with this constitutional analysis, striking down the law as unconstitutional. Then came the genuine shocker that stunned both sides of this debate. Instead of the decision being reversed through the usual en banc rehearing process where the full court reconsiders panel decisions, the Ninth Circuit issued the mandate on August 14, 2025, closing the case permanently. To fully grasp how monumentally significant this development is, you need to understand the Ninth Circuit's established pattern over decades. Each time a lower court issued a ruling favoring gun owners, the full circuit court, through an en banc rehearing process, would systematically erase that victory. Consider Duncan versus Bonta, where a magazine capacity ban was initially struck down as unconstitutional, only to be reinstated later by an en banc reversal, or Miller versus Bonta, where an assault weapon ban was ruled unconstitutional and then immediately stayed pending further review. Similar outcomes followed in ammunition regulation cases and open carry challenges. The pattern was absolutely consistent and demoralizing for gun rights advocates. Victories disappeared as predictably as sunrise. That's precisely why the Nguyen mandate stunned legal observers on both sides. For the first time in Ninth Circuit history, a Second Amendment ruling survived the process intact. It wasn't stayed pending appeal, wasn't reversed by the full court, wasn't sent back to lower courts for reconsideration. It stood firm as binding precedent, signaling what appears to be a profound shift in judicial philosophy regarding constitutional rights. California lawmakers didn't wait long to respond to this unprecedented defeat. Within weeks of the mandate being issued, the state legislature introduced Assembly Bill 1078, proposing what they characterized as a compromise, a 3 guns per month purchasing limit. On paper, supporters presented it as balancing public safety concerns with constitutional rights. In legal reality, it represented open defiance of the court's constitutional reasoning. The bill's sponsors claimed it addressed trafficking concerns while respecting the Second Amendment. Legal experts immediately noted that the exact same rationing logic the court rejected in Nguyen applies directly here. Constitutional rights cannot be rationed by government, whether the limit is 1 firearm, 2, 3, or any arbitrary number per month. The fundamental principle remains unchanged. As of October 2025, AB 1078 had cleared the California Assembly and was under review in the state Senate. Gun rights organizations, including the California Rifle and Pistol Association, immediately vowed to file litigation the moment it passes into law. The message from Sacramento is crystal clear. They may lose individual legal battles, but they will not stop testing the constitutional limits established by federal courts. The Ninth Circuit's language in the Nguyen decision left absolutely no room for misinterpretation or doubt. The judges wrote explicitly that constitutional rights are not privileges to be dispensed or rationed by state government. The opinion drew direct comparisons to help illustrate the absurdity of the rationing argument. They compared gun purchase limits to hypothetically restricting religious worship to once monthly or limiting how frequently journalists could publish articles. Such government rationing of constitutional rights, the court stated definitively, has no basis whatsoever in the nation's historical tradition and no legitimate place in American constitutional law. The ruling clarified that the Second Amendment stands on absolutely equal footing with every other enumerated constitutional right. The state cannot decide through legislation how often citizens may exercise their freedoms. The mandate makes this constitutional reasoning binding precedent throughout the entire Ninth Circuit jurisdiction, setting the legal stage for immediate challenges to any future legislative attempt to ration rights through time-based or quantity-based restrictions. This mandate doesn't just change the law within California's borders. It sends genuine shockwaves across the entire western United States. The Ninth Circuit's jurisdiction covers 9 states total, including Alaska, Arizona, Hawaii, Idaho, Montana, Nevada, Oregon, and Washington. Each of these states must now recognize the same constitutional boundary established by this precedent. The court made it clear that rationing constitutional rights, whether it's 1 gun monthly or 3, violates Second Amendment protections. Lawmakers in other Western states will have to seriously reconsider any similar restrictions currently on their books or being contemplated. Future courts will be forced to confront a simple legal question. If the Ninth Circuit explicitly calls such rationing unconstitutional, how can any other state possibly justify maintaining similar laws? While this ruling doesn't instantly erase every restrictive firearm law across 9 states overnight, It establishes clear binding precedent that cannot be easily ignored. It's a permanent legal marker that signals time-based or frequency-based firearm purchase laws have no constitutional foundation under American historical tradition. If there's one characteristic California lawmakers have consistently demonstrated over decades, it's that they never surrender on gun control battles without exhausting every possible avenue of resistance. Even as the Nguyen mandate was being finalized, Sacramento was already preparing its legislative counterpunch with Assembly Bill 1078. The timing itself is remarkable. The court just ruled definitively that rationing constitutional rights is unconstitutional, and the state's immediate response was simply to ration differently using modified numbers. The new proposal allows 3 gun purchases every 30 days instead of 1. Supporters are characterizing it as a reasonable safety measure designed to limit potential trafficking. Opponents argue it represents a direct attempt to sidestep the mandate through semantic games while maintaining the same unconstitutional rationing principle. This isn't merely legislative resistance to an unfavorable court decision. It's open defiance of constitutional limits established by binding federal precedent. And if California succeeds in redefining these boundaries through slightly modified restrictions, other states will absolutely follow the same path of creative noncompliance. This ongoing battle will ultimately determine whether the Nguyen versus Bonta mandate stands as a permanent constitutional victory or becomes merely the opening salvo in a new protracted round of legal warfare over gun rights. Here's what makes this particular moment in legal history truly unprecedented and genuinely bulletproof from a constitutional standpoint. A mandate is not a temporary opinion subject to reconsideration. It's not a soft ruling that might be modified later. It represents the court's final enforceable order with the full weight of federal judicial authority behind it. California cannot appeal this mandate to a higher court. The Ninth Circuit itself cannot withdraw or modify it through subsequent decisions. Even the United States Supreme Court has no obligation whatsoever to step in and review it because, legally speaking, there's no active controversy remaining that requires resolution. The mandate locks the constitutional decision as binding law across the circuit. It prevents further delay, reversal, or modification through standard appellate processes. It forces legal compliance within all states falling under Ninth Circuit authority. For gun owners who have spent literally decades watching hard-won legal victories disappear overnight through en-banc reversals or stays pending further review, this represents the first solid constitutional ground in generations. The mandate issued in Nguyen versus Bonta is not just another temporary panel win waiting to vanish. It's lasting precedent that stands on its own legal authority, marking what appears to be the beginning of a genuinely new era for Second Amendment jurisprudence in the Western United States. The political impact of this decision cannot possibly be overstated. For decades, gun control advocates relied heavily on the Ninth Circuit as their ultimate firewall against Second Amendment challenges. It was the court they could always count on to uphold virtually any restriction, no matter how severe. That firewall has now cracked wide open. Attorneys across the country will cite Nguyen versus Bonta in every rationing-related case moving forward. State legislators in places like Nevada and Arizona will face immediate pressure to align their laws with this binding precedent. National gun rights organizations are already deploying this case to challenge new legislative proposals in other circuits. Politically, this fundamentally changes the national conversation around gun rights. Lawmakers who once confidently leaned on the Ninth Circuit's historical deference to gun control now face the opposite reality. The most restrictive circuit court in America just delivered one of the strongest victories for gun rights in modern judicial history. Legal victories like this are extraordinarily rare, but they're never the end of the story. The fight now shifts from winning in courtrooms to defending this precedent against every possible form of legislative circumvention. California will absolutely continue pushing new forms of restriction, cleverly disguised as reasonable safety measures or administrative registration requirements. Expect to see new bills drafted as minor procedural adjustments to purchasing systems. Watch for expanded data collection schemes targeting firearm transactions under the guise of law enforcement tools. Stay alert for digital surveillance efforts packaged under public safety tracking justifications. Each of these legislative measures will test whether the Nguyen mandate truly holds its constitutional ground, or if states can successfully find creative loopholes to weaken its practical impact. This ruling ultimately isn't just about firearms policy. It's about whether states can continue systematically eroding constitutional freedoms under the politically popular label of public safety. the message to gun owners is absolutely clear. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and never assume a legal win means the political fight is over. That's it for today, folks. See you in the next video.